Right. And admitting everyone. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Zoom event at Avid Reader. There are more people entering the waiting room now, apparently, so let me let you all in. Great. Welcome to everybody who's coming in now to this special salon event. I'll just try and let as many people as come in before I do my introductions, because then it's hard to see you. But welcome, everybody. Okay. So tonight is a very special event, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on. Here it's the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to any other elders who are here tonight. And I'd also like to acknowledge that because this is a Zoom event and we're zooming out onto the lands of many different Aboriginal people across this country, I would like to acknowledge the elders of the land on which you're meeting on. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. So tonight is a very special event. It's our second, I think, ever Zoom salon event. Very, very exciting to have everybody here for this. We used to run these salons regularly in real life, where we introduce 3 emerging writers to you. And that's been very exciting to do that, because some of the writers that have come out of our salon events have actually gone on to publish their own books, and many of them win awards. In fact, Ellen Van Neerven had their first reading at our salon event at Avid Reader, Beck Jessen as well. It was all very, very exciting to see these people read for the first time, and then to see what happened to their careers after that. So it's been really fantastic to do that. Now, they've just changed the Zoom tools. So I'm currently just working out how to use them. So bear with me as I try and let a few more people in. Okay. All right. Excellent. So we're going to start off this salon event with a reader who is here but cannot hear us. We can hear him, but he cannot hear us. So his technology is not working either. So bear with us again as I introduce John, and then I unmute him and he can do his reading for you. So we have today John Arnold, who's from Innisfail in far north Queensland, and began writing as a means of escape after his internment in a Brisbane Catholic boys' school in 2013. He won the Bristol Prize for the short story Naked as Eve, and is now a student in Faber Academy at Avid Reader. So everybody welcome John as I ask him to unmute and tell him he's here. John.
Thank you. This is from something called Skeleton Creek. No one had expected Tio to drive to the house our great-grandfather built, stand under the rusty chandelier, put a .44 caliber in his mouth and pull the trigger. After his body had been removed, the specialist cleaners had arrived. They had bleached the walls and scrubbed the floorboards, had warned the discoloration was permanent. The varnish had long since worn away, they explained. The dry wood, neglected for 50 years, had trapped the liquid. At the funeral, I thought about that stain, how my great-grandfather's floorboards had retained some memory of their rainforest birth, of their buttress roots, and how, given a chance, they'd welcome Tio in, like nourishment. Today, the house in which Tio had died was out of sight. It stood where a road terminated, beyond green cane fields, across a highway. It was the smell of gun oil that made me think of him, welcoming, with its first bouquet of old leather, then increasingly acrid as a bitter chemical stink scoured the nostrils and exploded behind the eyeballs. Do you recognize this firearm, Mrs. DeGama? I was seated on a pastel-colored leather sofa with the approximate shape and contours of a deflated croissant. It belonged to my zia Francesca, who was pouring espresso, black as sin, into my cup, and swearing viciously in Veneto. Behind her, Sergeant O'Reilly walked past wearing plastic gloves and holding a shotgun. Francesca ignored him and, looking only at me, gestured to the crostoli made that morning, golden brown and snow-capped with icing sugar. Tell the fascist pig boy there's no wife on earth that can account for half the useless shit her husband keeps in the cellar. Would he expect me to account for every nail, every hammer? It'd be like picking out his sisters from a lineup of whores. Mother of God. My aunt declines to comment, Sergeant, I said. She's looking forward to the arrival of her legal representative so this misunderstanding can be resolved. Sergeant O'Reilly sighed. The elegant elderly woman swearing at him in an Italian dialect had taught him in year 1 and sang with his mother in the cathedral choir. He walked past a wall of studio photographs of Francesca's grandchildren and yelled, "It's a 9-gauge, Bran. Tag it, shove it in the back with the rest." I said to Francesca, "You've seen the search warrant?" I took a crostoli. It floated on my tongue like a swan, but before dissolving, short, sugary, and rich. The espresso chased it down in a bitter, oily slick. Francesca flicked one hand, brown fingers extended as though casting dice, gold rings flashing, mouth pursed in disgust. It was an immediately comprehensible gesture employed by elderly ladies within a 200-kilometer radius. It could be shorthand for everything from get rid of that dead python, it's stinking up the front garden, to my daughter-in-law's a slut who uses mince in her ragu. A warrant? A fancy bit of paper, an engraved card letting you know you're cordially invited to get bent over and buggered by the police. Jesus Christ, your great-grandparents came to this country to get away from the fascists. She turned her head to the foyer and said in English, "I hope the drug dealers and pedophiles are enjoying your little holiday, Sergeant."
Thank you. Thanks, John. Excellent. Thank you. That's fantastic. Thanks, John. I've heard John read before from this piece of work, and I'm sure that we're going to hear more from him in the future. All of the writing that I've heard so far has been very exciting. So now we have Jean. So Jean Taylor is here with us. Jean is a retired teacher who worked for 20 years in the adult education sector. I just thought in it, my brain went to a strange place when I read that in your bio just then, Jean. The adult education sector, where she wrote educational activities for several vocational sectors, as well as for literacy, English and humanities classes. Jean has an MPhil in creative writing from the University of Queensland and is now a student in Chris Olsen's Faber Academy novel writing course. So everybody welcome Jean.
Thank you, Chrissy. My main character is Ellie, who's had a number of appointments with a doctor, Sean, who includes clinical hypnotherapy and counselling in his practice. She went to see him because of her chronic insomnia, but recently she has talked to him about the concerns she has about gaps in her childhood memories. In the deep relaxation of the hypnotherapy trance, Ellie was calm, waiting. Sean raised something new. "You're a loving person, Ellen. I hear it in the way you speak about your son. I know you learnt that from someone. Who was that?" Ellie hesitated. Blankness descended. Sean continued, oh so softly and gently. "What about your parents? You've told me they could be angry, violent, but were they sometimes loving?" His question sucked the air out of her lungs. White noise surrounded her. She pushed it aside, and when she spoke, her voice was rough. "When I was little, I was too fat and so ugly. Couldn't run, couldn't climb trees, couldn't roller skate like a champion like Mum." Sean paused and let her words settle into the room. "So who was loving to you? Who was kind to you as a child, Ellen? Kind. Ellie Bell." A stuttering breath, and then sweetness. She spoke in a child's voice. Memories wrapped around her. She felt a strange tug towards an ethereal presence. Sean's voice broke into her fragment of memory. "Who called you Ellie Bell?" Her face grew hot and she couldn't breathe properly. Little gasps broke through. She couldn't speak. The lump in her throat was too hard. "Who called you sweetness?" Sean's voice was so quiet, so gentle, it pierced something. The mass in her throat started to quiver. It loosened. The room was warm and she felt cradled by the soft cushions around her. Everything in the room felt safe. Ellen, who called you Ellie Bell and sweetness? The chair started to shake. The whole room was trembling. The air around her was heavy. No, not the chair. She was shaking and she was crying. Nana, a child's whisper. It was Nana Joy. She began gulping for air and her face was wet with tears. She sniffled and took shuddering gasps. But Mum said, she said, you can't call her that. She's not your grandmother. She's just your granddad's new wife. But she said, it was her. She said I could call her Nana. Nana Joy. Ha! Her mother had laughed. Mrs. No Joy, more like. What a stupid girl, to think a name can make her your grandmother. She was a stupid girl. A name didn't make it real. And yet, sitting in Sean's room, she could almost feel Nana Joy's arms warm around her. She remembered sinking into her lap while Joy stroked her hair and kissed the top of her head. When Sean brought Ellie out of her trance, he continued their dialogue. So where is Nana Joy now? She died. They moved away when I was 9 and she got sick and died. That's what Mum said. And did you believe her? The pause ricocheted around the room. Ellie's head started to pound. Judy had lied to her so often. Why had she never thought to question her more thoroughly about this?
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's great. It's very exciting to begin to hear these. I've seen you guys work on the back deck with Chris Olsen for a while now, and it's very, very exciting to finally get to hear them. So thank you very much for reading them. I'm sure that we're going to see much more from this Faber Academy group. And our third reader is Katrina Mcdonald. Katrina lives on the Redcliffe Peninsula and is a long-time state government bureaucrat, but has always had an unfinished novel, poem, screenplay worrying the edges of her mind. So now she's undertaking the Faber Academy's writing a novel program in the hopes that she'll find out the ending of one of her novels. The inspiration for her piece of work came from a morning walk where, in a brief moment of mistaken identity, she believed she'd seen a small child wading into the local duck's pond. Turned out to be a beautiful egret, but the mistake has haunted her enough to want to write about it. So everybody, please welcome Katrina.
Thank you. This introduces the character Jay and his adoptive mother, and it's called Fledgling. She noticed tiny arrows pushing under his adolescent skin, taut and lighter at the peaked pressure points. 14, 15, 16, spike, 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 from clavicle along the undulation of his shoulder, from trapezoid falling to the halt at the deltoid. Tiny canines seeking a surface. She leaned in. For a moment, their heads were bowed together. Does it hurt? Her index finger lightly across the curiosity. No, not really, I guess. His voice bemused, almost childlike. With the violence of rising emotion, she wanted to pull him, lift all of him into her protective embrace. How long had it been since she'd been able to encompass him, keep him safe? Instead, she stepped back and muttered that she'd see what might be going on and wandered down the hall, Jay left behind, arm across his chest, watching the sunlight blur her edges. She found only strange stories of teeth and bones spilling from open cysts, calcified skeleton embryos absorbed by a remaining living twin, or, unbeknownst to a woman briefly harbouring a spark of life, a revelation of unconnected cartilage discovered in her menopausal body years and years later. Within the week, the spears had broken through. Each morning he'd present for inspection, becoming increasingly self-conscious, already at peak in the boy's puberty-thrashed body. He took to wearing shirts with collars and buttons so others could not see the strange melodic ripple. On the bus, sitting in class, kicking the ball in sweaty gaggles, without intent, his gaze would search those around him for a knuckle of ridges or bursting bullet head points, hoping this was a normal rite of passage into adulthood or interlude of teenage hormonal chaos. The daily inspection did not help his increasing panic that he'd soon become nothing but sharp points and ridges and would have to live in darkness, bent over with the weight of the grotesque. She read out the results of her 3rd week observation, the spikes now erupting the minuscule rough hairs, the fascination apparent in her voice. I'm a freak. What? No. Well, this doesn't seem to be usual, sure. But he heard panic in her voice. Now they headed into the difficult territory of feelings. Do you have them too? There's still so much about the human body we don't know, always more to learn. Her voice faded. How to tell him he could never be a freak, that this was, to her, simply further evidence he was to be valued. The discovery of him gave her life dimension. So the daily measuring and note-taking stopped, although she itched to continue. Yet Jay had already turned inward, avoiding any conversation other than the perfunctory. Exchanging interesting facts or a weekday moment seemed no more. Watching him put his bowl in the sink or hold a book close like a barrier, she started to miss him. Maybe a month later, or into 2, she sat at the kitchen bench, gazing sightlessly at the browning coagulation over her coffee. He appeared across from her, shirtless, in the greyed morning light. Their feathers.
Wow, that's amazing too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's great. Oh, look, I hope you get to the end of this book, and I really do hope I get to see all of these 3 novels published one day. It's been really excellent to have you today. Thank you. Now we're going to go to the main event, and tonight we have a very special treat. I have started reading this book tonight, which is Paige Clark's book, which is She is Haunted. And oh my goodness, it is amazing. I really recommend it. I highly recommend it. I'm hooked. I think that you have an amazing voice, and I'm so excited to continue reading it and to finish this book because it's exactly what I feel like reading at the moment. So it is it's now my job to introduce you to your host tonight. I'm just going to get her to unmute. Excellent. So we have Melanie. Melanie Saward is with us tonight, and Melanie is a proud descendant of the Bigambul and Waka Waka peoples. She's a writer, lecturer, and PhD candidate at the University of Technology, and she is going to have a conversation with Paige tonight. So everybody welcome Melanie.
Thanks, Chrissy. Hi, everybody. It's so great to be here, and it is my very, very great pleasure to introduce to you Paige Clark. Paige is a Chinese American Australian writer. She lives in Melbourne. She's in lockdown at the moment, so it's nice that she's here. Hopefully we're breaking up some of that lockdown monotony life, but it is such a pleasure to be here to talk to her about her absolutely breathtaking debut collection of short stories. I'm going to gush about it a lot because it is just, this is a wonderful book. The quote on the top from Robert Lukins says that Paige Clark is the best new writer in Australia, and I totally agree after reading this collection. So Paige, it's an incredible book, and I'm so glad to be here to talk to you. So to stop me from gushing, would you like to read a little bit from the collection before we start having a chat?
Yes, of course. So I guess I'd like to begin by saying that I'm zooming into you on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And as a colonizer, I like to acknowledge that those stories were here long before I was ever here writing stories. And so that's just where I'd like to start. I'll be reading out from a section of the book called A Story Called Gwendolyn Wakes. And this is the beginning, so it'll just launch you right into it. Gwendolyn worked at the Department of Recovery. Her specialty was ex-boyfriends, but she reconnected clients with ex-husbands, ex-girlfriends, and ex-fiancés too. Despite her expertise in her entire 34 years on the planet, Gwendolyn had never had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. She had never even, to her knowledge, had a crush. It was not that she was asexual. At night, she dreamt of having sex with the being. She often insert bodily response to sex act here. Maybe she was one of those people who fell in love with ghosts. Or maybe all of the work at the Department of Recovery had left her jaded and horny, able only to get off on the tragicomedy that was other people's lives. Her whole life, people had thought Gwendolyn was exceptionally attractive, meaning incredibly Anglo-Saxon. A send-away DNA test revealed she was almost completely Anglo-Saxon, even though those tests usually lied to make very Anglo-Saxon people feel better and said 12% Mediterranean or Polynesian. Gwendolyn herself did not think this trait made her exceptionally attractive. Instead, she thought it made her very boring. She believed women who were very black or very brown or very yellow were very beautiful, though she knew intimately how others fetishized minorities. She knew they thought, insert racist stereotypes here. Callers to the department told her there were all types of fetishes, fetishes about acquiring autoimmune diseases and fetishes about having sex with ghosts. Maybe this was what gave Gwendolyn the idea that she was sleeping with a celestial being in the first place. The work at the department was not all about sex. Most of it was about careers, babies, physical changes, and general aging. These parts of relationship turned Gwendolyn off. Within minutes of meeting someone, she saw them 5 years down the track when they had stopped shaving their insert body part here. She understood their head hair would thin and their taut body would soften. She knew it was only a matter of time. It was always only a matter of time before they would pick their boogers or crap with the bathroom door open. Gwendolyn could get all of that and more from her mother. And that's the end.
Thank you. That story was one that I actually wanted to talk about, so let's go there straight away. The collection, some ways when we talk about the themes that are in the collection, they can be seen as maybe a little bit dark, and I'm sure we will get into that as we keep talking tonight. But this one is one that you seem to balance that darkness with this really light sense of humor, and it's quite bleak at times as well. And I really wanted to talk to you about how you go about balancing the lightness and the darkness in your work. So you're covering off some quite serious things in a story like this, but it's kind of weird and wacky, and you manage to sort of punch us in the face with some big stuff but make it funny. And I wonder how you balance that.
Well, that's a great question. I don't know if it's necessarily on purpose. I think when I first started out writing, I had this intention of being a really serious writer. I didn't see myself as being a comedic writer at all. Even though in my real life, I try to see myself as being very funny, and I make jokes all the time that actually maybe don't land in person. So I'm actually not that funny in real life. But then whenever people would read my work, they would say, oh, this is funny. Like, there's so many jokes in here. And I think that really what it is that all the jokes that I've been trying to make in real life over the years that don't land because I laugh at my own joke and kill the punchline, I make up for it on the page. So it's the humor that's in the book is really that kind of, feeling after you've hung out with someone and, you feel like I had such a good punchline, but I didn't say it. That's kind of, I put that into the work. So I never really think about it as being, a kind of contrast to the darkness, but it's really more of just a chance to, show everyone how funny I am.
Well, you've done that. So, and it was a good one to choose to read because it is quite funny. So to go back and touch on the themes, the piece, the whole collection is very different. Every story is very different. Some of them are a bit weird and go to some strange places. Some of them feel a bit more realistic, but you have these really strong themes and motifs that you carry all the way through that seem to link it together. So you've got things like relationships, mothers, race, husbands and lovers, friendships, death, grief. There's a huge list: illness, trauma, pregnancy, connection, belonging, and dogs. We have to talk about dogs. But how conscious were you of tying these themes together? Did you think this was going to be a collection when you were writing? I know you were writing it for a while, but did you think it was going to be a collection, and were you tying these things together?
Well, I guess I always hoped that it would be a collection, mainly because I'm really lazy and I don't like to see any words go to waste. And I don't know if there's other writers in here that feel that way as well, but any kind of wasted word to me, it's everything I ever write down. I want to do something with it because it all just feels so hard to eke out for me. So I think I always had, this dream that it would be a collection, but I didn't really envision it into a book until I was about halfway through. And then I guess in terms of, the themes and the motifs and those emerging, the work I wasn't trying to make more connections. I was actually trying to make fewer. So the first kind of 30,000 words, I thought, whoa, there's too many dogs in this, and there's too many mother and daughters. And I thought, okay, I need a bit of balance. I need to try to go a bit to places that I haven't been before. So that's when I started to imagine, a character that was a much, much older woman than myself, or a character from a male point of view. And there's only a few stories like that, but I hope that they, provide just a little counterpoint or a little bit of balance from this kind of really singular first person female voice that I guess is very close to myself. So in that way, I actually tried to go further beyond where I was starting out with these themes.
Yeah, I think it definitely has done that. I think, it is a collection, but it does have that cohesive journey, even though there are moments in there that break it up. It starts with something that I felt was a little bit playful, with the character in Elizabeth Kubler-Ross negotiating with God about life and death of babies and husbands and pets and mothers. And then it ends on probably a fairly dark note, one of the darkest notes in the book, with the story Dead Summer, that follows a character who falls apart and starts seeing death in absolutely everything after her mother dies. It's really clear when you read the collection that it was put together with a lot of really deliberate thought, as to, how it comes together and the journey that the reader takes with you. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about choosing the order and maybe even which stories came first for you.
Yes. Well, I think it's funny that you mentioned, that last story, and maybe how it doesn't have the same lightness as the others. And I think that story was the first story that I ever wrote. It was the first thing that I ever finished. And so maybe in that way, it's not as fully realized in terms of having these other kind of elements, these sort of comedic elements. But I think that maybe the emotional, content of that was really developed. And when I went to order the book, I sort of always knew, that the narrative, the book, this is, hopefully not a spoiler for those of you that haven't read it. I don't think it gives too much away, but it's, the overarching theme of the book is me trying to understand, my relationship with my mother, me coming to terms with the fact, that I no longer have a relationship with my mother for whatever reason. And so I knew that story was the ending point because of where that story finishes. I felt like, even though I wrote it first, that's where I had to get to. I had to sort of show all this healing that happened along the way to me to get to that point at the end. So that was very deliberate. And well, the first story, they always say when you're ordering a short story collection that you should start with the best story to hook them in. And I don't actually know if I think that's the best story or if it's my favorite story, but a lot of people told me that they really liked it. So I sort of started with it there just to see, but then it actually ended up making sense because I feel that it does have this sort of fable-like quality. It has a really sort of universal feeling. And then maybe it kind of goes from this really universal experience to more and more specific as the book continues. So once I did that, I thought, no, this makes sense, not just because it's grabby, but I think it makes sense for the book as well.
Yeah, excellent. So you talked about how the book is about you exploring that relationship with your mother. And I think that all of the stories feel really intimate, as though you're actually inviting the reader to share your life and experiences through these different characters who seem like they're parts of you or aspects of you. How do you create that intimacy, and how does it feel to invite people into your mind like that?
Oh, well, I think that, before I ever finished that first story, I did try my hand at writing other stories. And for a long time, I didn't feel comfortable writing about myself. I didn't think that I had anything important to say. I thought other people had, more interesting lives and more interesting stories than I did. And I ended up writing really poorly as a result of it. Some people can do that kind of work and write really well, but I'm not one of them. And I had written a few terrible stories. And I think that it was finally, when I sat down and I was like, I have something that I need to, to say, to understand. And it had to come from me, like something I was trying to figure out, which, was my relationship with my mom, but then it became, many other things. It actually felt less scary than when I was working in this kind of world that was very artificial and trying to tell stories that I was making up. It felt, it almost felt as easy as writing ever feels.
Wow, that's so good to hear. Like, yeah, it's something that really struck me, and I wrote down when I was reading it that I wanted to talk to you about that intimacy in terms of writing about your Asian American Australian identity, which is something else that came through really really strongly in the piece. And I've got a few things to ask you about that theme there. But just to move on from the intimacy aspect, I think that reading the voice of those who are othered or marginalized can actually be a really good way of creating empathy and hopefully change. And I think some of the techniques that you use in your writing are actually very strong vehicles for this. But as a Black fellow who writes often very personal things myself, I think it's really tough to feel safe in the public sphere after you've put something out like that. So you might feel safe as you're writing it, but when you are in a Zoom meeting with 28 people that you don't really know, it can feel a little bit difficult to be asked to talk about those experiences. Can you talk about how you safely navigate this space now that your book is out in the world, and how you keep yourself protected from, those things that are not so nice about this country?
That's such a funny question, because I think that, maybe I naively, before I put the book out, I didn't actually think that what I was doing was that subversive. I just thought, these are my experiences. This is, what I'm writing about my experiences, and it's very specific to me. So I didn't see anything as being subversive. I didn't see myself as putting myself into the public space in that way. And then there have been some reactions to the book that surprised me, just little comments of oh, the Chinese content in this was so forward, and those kind of things that I guess you're talking about being a person that's representative of a bigger group of people, and you don't want to be. I just want to be representative of me and my tiny little experiences in this world. And I don't know the answer for navigating that, except for complaining about it, to my friends, and then also maybe feeling like, okay, this is actually important work that I need to do. It's actually more important than I initially thought, because these voices are important for that reason, because they still are met with pushback, because people still, see these stories as being very other, as being very much on the fringes or the margins. And so, hopefully that's going to motivate me in writing the next book.
Yeah, it's really, I see it as really important that we're also seeing, the myriad of identities that come within those groups, while you're maybe being a representative of Asian, Australian, American people with that work. You can't represent everyone with that identity. So yeah, I think that's an excellent answer. So what does a transnational Asian identity mean to you then, to ask you that incredibly broad question, but because it is something that I think you explore really well in the book.
Yeah, well, I guess, being a mixed race person in general, that I spent a lot of, my life blending into whiteness because it was easier. I couldn't blend into whiteness because of the way that I look. I'm not really white passing, but in terms of culturally, I was very, I had a close proximity to whiteness. And so for many years, that was the path that I took. And, that's not a judgment on my former self. That was just, that was the reality, and that was what made me feel safe. A thing when I was much younger, in my early 20s, I was really proud of the fact that I couldn't use chopsticks. I would use that as a way to signal to people, look at how safe of a person I am, look at how not Asian I am, I can't even use chopsticks. And of course, now I'm completely humiliated by that. But I guess bringing it back to the book, the way that comes into play is that you'll see a lot of these characters searching to connect with their identity. That part of the journey of identity is maybe not being completely connected to that. So there's a character that tries to learn to speak Cantonese. They often date white men, and then are put in these kind of strange power dynamics because of those relationships. So there is that navigation of where your culture sits within yourself even.
Yeah, thank you. Even, you talk about that being shamed of not identifying with your culture and so on. I mean, there are lots of us. I know certainly as a white passing Black fella, I've certainly done things like that to myself. So I think that the book, even broadly speaks to a whole bunch of us out there, that can identify with a lot of those themes. I want to talk about code switching for a second. I want to talk about this story, Private Eating, in which a man shows up to a date with a woman and announces that he's a vegetarian and asks if she is too. And even though she's not, she says she is. And she embarks upon this thing she calls private eating, where she eats things that she wants to when she's alone, burgers and pizza. But she maintains this public persona when she's with him, and it sort of expands out to how she behaves when she's with her friends and with her mother as well. And it feels to me like the identity around food in this story becomes a form of code switching, and it really spoke to me as an Aboriginal woman who finds herself constantly code switching depending on who's around. I'd love to hear more about this story and where it came from and what you were thinking while you were writing this one.
Well, I started out because I'm on a constant journey of becoming a vegetarian, which has yet to pan out for me. So I think I've gone 1 week before I had a breakdown in front of a KFC and got a drunk. And it was so delicious. But obviously also, going back to this idea of trying to find, my own connection to my culture, a big part of that has always been, through food and eating Chinese food. So they do play in together. And, for many years, my excuse for not becoming a vegetarian was, I can't become a vegetarian, I'm Chinese, like so much of the food is meat-based. And I even said, this is my only connection to my heritage. It's so important to me to be able to eat this Chinese food. And it's just not the same, if I'm eating just tofu in the like weird glummy kind of sauce that probably has chicken in it anyway. Sorry to all of you vegetarians. But yeah, so that's kind of where that story started from, this sort of what if someone was just pretending to be a vegetarian? Because you're always, when you meet someone new or friends or people that you date, you're always trying to show them this kind of version of yourself that you think that they want you to be. And it takes a while to break those barriers down. So I guess that was the premise of the vegetarianism, but it sort of expands in that story to be that she really is hiding so much of who she is from this gentleman. So her career, she has a really successful career, but his career always takes precedent. His kind of thoughts about food, they go to a Thai restaurant and he talks about, how he loves Thai food and he loves Thai people. And even though she's uncomfortable with that dialogue, she just sits there and listens to it because of this wanting to be accepted, by a white man specifically. So I think that that's sort of where the play in that story comes from.
Yeah, I could see that. I really love that story a lot. I went back to that and read it a couple of times actually. One of the things that I noticed is that your characters who are not Chinese are really clearly identified as such, but then you've got many female viewpoint characters who are both unnamed and unraced in the piece. And then I read an article that you'd written for Junkie where you talked a bit about how these unnamed and unraced women are all mixed race Chinese women, and that the way that you had written them was a really deliberate choice. And obviously that's because some of those come from your point of view and so on. But I wondered if you want to talk a little bit about that choice to write that way.
Yeah, so I think, this is something that's really important to me because I found it really uncomfortable when I first started writing to racialize my characters. So some of those stories where the characters are not, explicitly raced was because of my own discomfort. It wasn't that, I didn't see them as being, mixed race Chinese or Chinese. It was just that I didn't want to have to do that work. And I guess, you see all the time white writers don't have to do that work. Their characters are just kind of automatically seen as white, so that was my first kind of pushback was, well, I don't want to do that work. These characters are just Chinese. But then I realized that, so much of the problem is white writers not doing the work to racialize their characters. And it's something I really feel strongly about is how are you going to write in the race of your own characters? And I thought if I'm doing that, then I need to do that for my white characters as well. And I think sometimes it stands out and people, will draw attention to it. Oh, you said this person is white. But it's really no different to how other white writers, signal if someone is Asian or South Asian or et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that, if more white writers especially were to start doing that with their own characters, how powerful would that be? How would that change things so that my stories were no longer as much on the fringe? I just have to believe that work is part of the work that moves writing forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I totally agree. So She is Haunted is the name of one of the stories in the book, but to me, it feels like that absolute perfect phrase to sum up the collection. Were there any other contenders for the title, or and why did you think that this one captured it so well?
Well, I can't take any credit for this. I had another title, which was Of No Language. And that comes from a line in one of the stories that, is, I don't understand my mother. She is of no language, I know. And there are a lot of, miscommunications. There is this idea in the book of people trying to say things that go beyond the surface all the time.
Yeah.
But my agent did not think that was a very good title. And she thought it was, a bit too, intellectual or too quiet. But, she kind of was like, She is Haunted. It just jumped out at her right away. And, from the minute when she said, oh, I think it's a bit, it's not quite right, that other title, I was like, yeah, that's not the title. It's definitely not the title. And then as, the book started to come together more and more, and we got the cover, it just really seemed like, okay, this is why you have an agent, because they know better than you do about some things. And that was very much the right fit for the book.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's nice sometimes to have someone take the wheel on those things like that. Okay, I want to ask the dog question now. So as a dog lover whose dog is currently sitting right there, making some really interesting smells and sounds while we're talking, I feel like we have to talk about them. Now, I'm loath to equate your writing with Elizabeth Tan for obvious reasons, but I pose to you that your work dogs in your work is as cats are to Elizabeth Tan's smart ovens, I think. And when I read it, I felt like the that you've really shown someone who has a love and understanding of the joy and the revulsion that dogs bring into our life. And I wondered if you could maybe talk about the significance of the dogs in your work and how you go about writing such realistic relationships with them.
I think, well, I'm really happy to hear that comparison, because I've gotten the Elizabeth Pan comparison before, but I haven't been able to, and it's kind of, not irritating me because she's an incredible writer, but I was like, it's not right. It doesn't feel right. But I feel like actually that comparison highlights exactly what the difference is between me and Elizabeth Tan. She's a cat person and I'm a dog person. So, take what you will. I also love cats, for all of you cat fans out there. I've got no problem with cats except for my allergies. But I'm a fan of the cat. But yeah, the dogs, I think that, and maybe this kind of goes hand in hand with that idea of humor that we were talking about earlier. I think that, when you're dealing with really heavy themes, when you're dealing with grief and loss, sometimes you need to find the obvious joy. And to me, there is no more obvious joy in this world than a dog. And just the complexity and nuance of dogs and how they kind of understand us and allow us to understand ourselves. I just think, for me, I couldn't not write it in. I didn't ever do it on purpose, but there would just always be a dog that was sort of encountering a situation or was being there to soothe or love or, poop somewhere that they shouldn't have, because that's what dogs do as well. And that is, I guess, just part of the way that I see the world. I can't walk by a dog on the street without saying hello. I asked someone the other day, I said, is it rude that I don't say hello to the owners? And they said, I think it's a little bit rude, but I can't help myself.
That's exactly what I'm like, so it's fine. I was talking to someone about your book today and she was like, oh, I'm a crazy dog lady, I think I better buy that book. So I think it's a good sales and marketing technique as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the short story as a format. What draws you to writing short stories?
Well, I guess the most obvious answer to me is that you can be finished with it sooner. And I always, say I would be a poet if I were a good enough writer, because I really love these short forms that are so condensed, that can do so much work in such a little space. But I don't quite have the ear for poetry. I think I've almost got it, but I'm a good enough poet to know that I'm not very good at all. So I think that for me, I really see the short story as being, the next kind of logical progression from poetry, that you can do that work at the line level. And you can really focus on how each, sentence sounds. I think I've heard the distinction made between poetry, short stories, and novels as, the unit in a poem is the word, the unit in a short story is the sentence, and the unit in a novel is a chapter. And I think my mind just really works on that sentence level. And so for that reason, I've always been drawn to the short story.
Yeah, that's a really lovely way of thinking about it. Do you think that with short stories, there's actually room to be a bit more playful and experimental as well? Some of your pieces we've talked about already go to some quite weird and wacky places that might be difficult to sustain across a novel. Do you think that there's some freedom in that form as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a lot of room for playing with time, playing with voice, playing with almost every element of craft. I think that another thing that I've said that's a bit more self-deprecating is, I write short stories because I would be so exhausting in the novel form. I feel like the voices that I like to develop, they can be really intense or overwhelming or unlikable or unreliable in this way that would be difficult to sustain in a longer work. But that, for 2,000 words, sometimes the reader is willing to follow you to lots of different places that maybe they wouldn't if they were investing more of their time into it.
Yeah. So do you see yourself as a short story writer, or are you going to give the novel a burn in the future?
I very much see myself as a short story writer. I'm interested, and I've said this before, I'm interested in fragmented novels because I think that they have a lot of the same opportunities that short stories do to play at that line level or play with, experimentation and gaps and spaces, which I'm also really interested in. But, for now, I'm just going to say I'm very happily a short story writer. And I think, my favorite writers are all short story writers. I love the form. I think that it's incredible.
Fantastic. This has been such an amazing conversation. And thanks, Melanie, for your questions as well. I didn't get to ask before we started our conversation, but if you do have any questions from the audience, if you can put them in the chat function. And I have found that now in the new updated Zoom, which didn't actually let me type in before. So that's open now, and anyone who has any questions can type in there. I'm actually interested in just starting that off by asking about your favourite short story writers, because I'm reminded a little bit of Carmen Maria Machado when I read your work, and the kind of weird fiction. I'm actually reading a book called Night Bitch at the moment, which reminds me really much of your style of work, and it's beautiful form. Do you have a set of writers that you really admire in the short story form?
Well, I'm actually a really big Ellen Van Nerven fan. So when you were talking about them having read at the salon, I was fangirling a little bit. I thought, oh, they did this event and now I'm doing this event. So I think, definitely that's one of my favorite kind of contemporary short story writers. I am also, I'm a big fan of some of the American minimalist classics like the Amy Hempels and Raymond Carvers, all the Gordon Lish sort of students. But I guess maybe this goes back to things that Mel and I have been talking about earlier. I love those works, but it's really difficult for me to see myself in that work as well. So I guess that's my kind of, I love that work, but with that asterisk of a big but.
Yeah, fantastic. I think we've got something here. Oh, it's just a comment from Katrina, who said that your words tonight have been very wise and that she's been taking notes. And I think that it has been good. We've got a few writers here, actually. I know that Laura Elvery is here and has been listening. And I think Laura might have had a question. But
I see it. Do you want me to read it?
Do you want us to read? Laura did just after that say maybe don't read that out. Do you want me to read that question out, Laura? In the chat. Yes, okay, we can read that out.
Okay.
Yep, go for it, Melanie.
It says, I'm halfway through and loving your book. Congrats, Paige. Can you talk about the first story you wrote in She Is Haunted and the last one? How do they compare and what do they have in common?
Oh, that's such a good question. I guess I'll begin as well by saying thank you to all of the salon readers. All of your work was so incredible and inspiring. So I was also, taking mental notes of little images and little things that you were doing. And I was thinking, wow, Faber Academy is so good. I might have to go myself. So, yeah, so that's my first note. My second note is Laura Elvery definitely doesn't, need to find out about short stories from me because that's the master herself. So those are my kind of intros to the answering this question. But talking about the first story I wrote and the last, how do they compare and what do they have in common? So the last story I wrote for the book was the one that I read from, Gwendolyn Wakes. And so on the face of it, they don't have a lot in common. One is first person, the other is third person. I don't feel as comfortable in the third person. So I really, pushed myself in that way to write more stories in the third person. Gwendolyn is one of the only white narrators, but again, in that story, I really play a lot with this idea of whiteness. And I think in a lot of ways, it kind of pushes the boundaries in terms of playing with race a lot more than that first story does, which doesn't even mention it. I think the only and even signal that the characters might be Asian is that there might be dark hair, but maybe not even that. So in that ways, they're very different. I guess one, is really sort of pared back and emotional, and the other is doing a lot of that work of never playing into emotions specifically and doing a lot of kind of more action-based work. But I guess what they have in common is that they're both very much come from some part inside myself of trying, to understand why, or answer this question of why. And though they're asking why about different things, it's still doing that work of why is it like this? So for that first story, why, what is it like? Why do we have to keep living, without our parents, with these horrible things that happen? And in the Gwendolyn Wakes story, it's, why do we keep going? What is the reason for making these connections with people? What is the reason for having intimate relationships? What is that why? And I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I'm sure it does. And Laura says, thank you. So yes, that does answer the question. Thanks very much. Are there any other questions from the audience? If you do, type them into that chat function. I'm really keen to ask you about that. The publication of a collection of short stories, because there is a perception in the publishing industry that unless you're working towards a novel, and I know short story writers who've only been given a contract for a collection of short stories if they are contracted for a novel after, there's this kind of thing that we can't just stick on short stories. Do you think that's changing? Because I think that there's a generational change with poetry. Definitely poetry is much more read these days. Do you think that is happening with short stories as well?
I really hope that it is. I think that, this year, Chloe Wilson's Hold Your Fire also came out, which is another big collection of short stories as well. I think that I always had heard that narrative as well, that it's impossible to get a collection of short stories published. And I think that, it's a deeply held belief among writers. And I don't know if as much, I think that people that work in publishing, they're always looking for ways that can push the envelope and push boundaries. And I think that, if you're a short story writer that's doing that there is an openness to it. But at the same time, I think if you're a writer that's, writing short stories for university and you're planning on writing a novel, then maybe that also comes through. And so maybe those collections are more difficult to get published. But I guess for, all the aspiring short story writers that, they know that this is their craft and this is what they're meant to do, I think you've just got to do it and you'll find the home for it.
Great. We've got a question from Yana here. I'd love to know about Paige's decision to abandon social media. Is it temporary? What did your agent think about that? And how has it been without social media? Debut author.
Oh, well, my agent and publisher were very supportive of me not being on social media. And I think that this is a misconception maybe that people have about social media, which is, that it can be very effective. And I think, what I've heard and from my own experiences, unless you already have a huge following on social media, you're really talking to your closest friends and maybe a few other people. So that's not why I left social media. I left social media because I am an absolute addict. I still spend way too much time on my phone without social media. So with social media, I would spend up to 8 hours a day on my phone. And I really did it because you can't write a book if you're spending that much time on social media. You just cannot do it. So that's why I quit. And I guess I would say, unless it's your passion to be running social media accounts and engaging in a certain way, it's taking up a lot of time. Maybe even set it on private and just post pictures of your dog for your friends. I don't know what it's actually done for me in terms of putting the book out there. If people have been looking for me, I have a website. I do have ways that hopefully you can find me, and more so now. And hopefully I'm contactable and still approachable. And I don't actually know the answer to that question, but yeah, I think social media is a job. It's a job and people make living off of it. And I'm not one of those people.
Right. I think my partner thinks that you should have some sort of a license to be on social media. So I think you've got the right idea there, which is great. Look, we're coming to the end of our time together, and I also just wanted to say that when you were talking about that idea that there's an assumption of whiteness with a character when they're written, there's also an assumption of heterosexuality, and I think it really resonated with me that we just assume, even if a character's sexuality isn't talked about in a story, that we're talking about a heterosexual person. And that's one of my main bugbears too. So it was really great for you to articulate that too. So yeah, look, so many ideas that have been buzzing around in my head tonight. I think that it's been fantastic to sit down and talk with you, because it's really sparked off a whole lot of ideas that I know I'm going to go away and talk about now. Melanie, you did such a great job. That was fantastic. Paige, I love this book. I really love this book, and I highly recommend it to everybody. And I don't do this very often. We run events every night of the week, and I very rarely say you do have to all go out and get this book, but this is really fantastic. And to our salon readers, you guys are great. That was really fantastic to hear you read. I can't wait to read your books. I really do hope that you get to the end of this process with Chris Olsen and come out the other end with a really finished and polished piece of work, because I'm really looking forward to running events for you guys soon too. So that would be really fantastic. Excellent. Look, thank you very, very much. Thanks, everybody. And our time is up, and let's go out and read books. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chrissy. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
That's great. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.